It was the third day of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, and the hall was buzzing with the usual diplomatic chatter. Delegates from every corner of the globe filled the room, some eager to listen, others eager to be heard. But no one expected sparks to fly when Senator J.D. Vance of the United States and Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso crossed paths. Traoré, dressed in a simple dark suit with a green lapel pin shaped like the African continent, took his seat quietly near the front. His reputation had preceded him, young, fierce, and unflinching in his defiance of neo-colonial influence. He had already made headlines in Africa and beyond for nationalizing gold mines and rejecting foreign aid tied to exploitation. Across the room, J.D. Vance adjusted his red tie and scanned the audience with the smugness of someone who believed he was always the smartest man in the room. When his turn to speak came, he walked to the podium with rehearsed confidence. "Let's be honest," Vance began, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Some nations come here to posture, to preach about sovereignty while depending on countries like ours to survive. Some leaders," his eyes drifted toward Traoré, "don't even belong on this stage." A collective breath was held, cameras turned, whispers rippled across the room. Traoré didn't flinch, he didn't even blink, he simply folded his hands calmly in front of him, his gaze locked on Vance, not with anger, but with a look that said, "You've just made a mistake." The tension in the air was palpable. Delegates shifted uncomfortably. Some American officials exchanged awkward glances. The African bloc sat upright, tense, alert. As Vance concluded with another veiled jab about grateful allies and responsible leadership, it became clear, he had come not to build bridges, but to throw stones. And the stone he just threw was about to ricochet. Because next, Traoré would speak, and the world was about to hear something it wouldn't forget. The next speaker on the list was Captain Ibrahim Traoré. As his name echoed through the hall, a stillness fell. Cameras pivoted, eyes sharpened. Even those who had buried their heads in briefing papers or phones moments earlier were now alert. Traoré rose from his seat without haste. No entourage followed, no stack of papers in hand. Just a man with fire in his eyes and the weight of a continent behind his words. He walked toward the podium, not like a man stepping into battle, but like one returning home. The silence grew heavier with each step. At the front, J.D. Vance sat, arms crossed, wearing a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. Traoré adjusted the microphone, glanced over the room, then began, not with fury, but clarity. "Mr. Vance," he said, pausing just enough for everyone to realize this wouldn't be a generic diplomatic speech, "you said some of us don't belong on this stage." The tension cracked like thunder. "Well, let me say this, not only do we belong here, but we bring with us the echoes of empires, the scars of plunder, and the strength of survival. My people did not vote for your approval. We earned our place here with blood, resilience, and rebirth." Gasps, murmurs, a few claps. But mostly, shock. He continued, unshaken. "You speak of aid as if it's mercy. But too often, your help arrives in the form of chains wrapped in flags. You offer handshakes with one hand while the other signs contracts that rob us of our soil, our dignity, and our future." Vance sat motionless, lips pursed. The cameras captured everything, his shifting jawline, his pale, rigid knuckles gripping the armrest. "But today," Traoré said, voice rising slightly, "Africa is not bowing. Not begging. We are building. We are healing. We are feeding our own, powering our cities, guarding our lands. And no one, not even the senator from Ohio, will decide if we are worthy." By now, the applause had begun. First a murmur, then a wave. Delegates from across Africa stood. So did many from Latin America, parts of Asia, and even a few from Europe. Traoré stepped back from the mic, not because he was finished, but because he had said enough. J.D. Vance stared forward, expression frozen. But inside, something cracked. This wasn't just a rebuke, it was a revolution, and it had a name. The applause didn't fade, it thundered, rising and falling in waves as if the words Traoré had spoken were still bouncing off the marble walls of the General Assembly Hall. Delegates whispered, nodded, pointed. Some, stunned, sat still, trying to process what had just occurred. But J.D. Vance didn't move. He remained seated, staring straight ahead as if by refusing to acknowledge Traoré's words, he could erase their power. But it was too late. The cameras had captured every second, and more importantly, so had the world. Back in Burkina Faso, massive screens in Ouagadougou's main square replayed the speech live. People gathered, cheering. Markets paused. Radios played it on repeat. The youth, once dismissed as a lost generation, watched a leader speak not in fear, but with fire. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., aides scrambled. The White House press team whispered about damage control. Networks interrupted regular programming. Conservative pundits tried to spin it, but it was hard to argue against truth when the delivery hit like a hammer wrapped in dignity. Back inside the UN, Traoré had returned to his seat. A delegate from Chile leaned in and whispered, "You didn't just speak, you cracked the ceiling." Another from Kenya offered a quiet nod of solidarity. But then, the silence broke again, this time not with applause, but with a voice. One of the older European diplomats, usually silent, turned to his neighbor and muttered, "That young man speaks with the ghosts of Lumumba and Sankara standing beside him." And he wasn't wrong. Traoré's words weren't just about one senator's arrogance. They were a rejection of centuries of dominance disguised as diplomacy. A rejection of the soft colonization that came with loans, corporations, and speeches about civilization. Backstage, reporters fought for angles. Traoré slams U.S. Senator at UN. Africa's rising voice. A battle of words, a war of worlds. But for Traoré, it wasn't about headlines. It was about history finally speaking back. By morning, Traoré's words had gone viral. Every major news outlet, from CNN to Al Jazeera to France 24, featured clips of his defiant stare and razor-sharp reply. On social media, the hashtag #WeBelongHere trended globally. Millions of Africans shared the video with captions like, "Finally, someone said it." Even many Americans, frustrated with the hypocrisy of their own politicians, applauded the Burkinabe captain's courage. In Ohio, J.D. Vance's team released a short statement. Senator Vance stands by his comments. But no press conference followed, no TV appearance, just silence, and silence was blood in the water. In New York, reporters swarmed the UN entrances, hoping to get a second soundbite from Traoré. But he didn't take the bait. He remained in closed meetings with fellow African leaders, where his words now carried even more weight. He did what most of us think but never dare say, one West African diplomat murmured. He said it with clarity. With pride, with no fear. Back in Washington, progressive voices amplified the moment. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett tweeted, "What Traoré said at the UN wasn't just brave, it was necessary. The world is changing. About time we listened." Meanwhile, conservative anchors on networks like Fox tried desperately to twist the narrative. Pete Hegseth, furious on live television, fumed, "This guy insults America in our house, and people clap? Disgraceful." But the public wasn't buying it, because the image was too strong, a young African leader, standing calm and sharp while a U.S. senator tried to shame him, and failed. Students at Howard University painted murals overnight. One showed Traoré standing at a podium made of African soil, facing down a giant shadow labeled Empire. The caption read, "We belong, you fear that?" The moment had become a movement, and somewhere in a quiet office, J.D. Vance reviewed the footage again. Rewound it. Stared at the look in Traoré's eyes. It wasn't hate, it was clarity, and it couldn't be debated away. Behind closed doors at the African Union delegation office in Manhattan, the mood had shifted. What was once cautious diplomacy had turned into coordinated momentum. Ministers spoke with new urgency. Ambassadors who once hesitated to challenge Western narratives now referred to Traoré's words as a turning point. "He cracked something open," said the Nigerian representative, "and we'd be fools not to follow through." Traoré, however, wasn't celebrating, he was strategizing. Sitting in a small briefing room with maps, economic reports, and satellite data laid out before him, he and his advisors weren't just basking in applause, they were planning what came next. His mission had always been larger than speeches. He wanted systems to fall, pipelines to be reclaimed, contracts rewritten, resources nationalized not in theory, but in law. This isn't about ego, he reminded them. It's about ending the lie, that we need permission to be free. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the ripple effects were being felt in ways the US hadn't prepared for. Several African nations quietly cancelled upcoming trade meetings with American firms. A major Pan-African tech summit in Kigali, originally set to feature US sponsors, announced it would instead prioritize investment from within the continent. The message was clear: dependency was no longer the currency of progress. Inside the Pentagon, analysts flagged the speech as a soft power disruption event. One memo read, "Traoré's rhetoric is igniting anti-Western sentiment in strategic regions. Urgent recommendation, recalibrate diplomatic posture." At the United Nations, whispers turned into meetings. Nations from the global south approached Traoré not just with respect, but with proposals. Shared defense strategies, joint economic corridors, media platforms free from Western editorial control. Yet in the midst of this whirlwind, Traoré remained focused. "We won the room," he told his ambassador, "but we haven't won the future, not yet." Then came the unexpected call, a direct request from a high-level advisor in the White House. "President Biden would like to meet you, privately." Traoré didn't answer right away. He leaned back, looked out over the city, and said quietly, "Tell him I'll think about it." Because for once, the world was turning toward Africa, not with orders, but with questions. And this time, Africa had answers. The official email had been sent through secure diplomatic channels. President Joseph R. Biden requests a private audience with Captain Ibrahim Traoré, on the grounds of the White House, to discuss matters of shared concern and global stability. To most world leaders, this would have been an honor. A sign of validation. Proof that Washington had finally taken notice. To Traoré, it was a chess move. He held the printed invitation in his hands, eyes scanning every word. Not because he doubted its content, but because he knew what it represented. "He wants to get ahead of the fire," Traoré muttered to his chief of staff. "Not put it out, just control the burn." Washington had always worked this way: charm the rebellious, offer them a seat at the table, then make the table theirs. With a smile. With photo ops. With polite language covering centuries of muscle. But Traoré wasn't hungry for seats. He was building his own table. Still, the opportunity couldn't be ignored. A private meeting at the heart of the empire? Eyes would be watching. Cameras wouldn't be allowed in, but the world would still listen. He consulted no one. Not his foreign minister, not his security team. Just a walk through Central Park at dusk, the wind slicing through the autumn leaves. Alone, with the sounds of the city dimming beneath his thoughts. By the next morning, his reply was sent. "Captain Traoré will attend." But not in silence. The American side confirmed. The meeting was set. Inside the West Wing, Jake Sullivan reviewed briefings. Every word Traoré had ever said. His education, his writings, his speeches. "He's not just bold," Sullivan told the president. "He's surgical. This won't be easy." Biden nodded. "Then we'd better be honest. Because if we're not, he'll bury us with our own hypocrisy." As Air Force One awaited in Maryland to bring Traoré from New York to D.C., the world watched. Would this be confrontation, or co-optation? Would Traoré be absorbed, or would he draw a line too sharp to ignore? And as his motorcade pulled into the restricted zone of the White House, a thought passed through his mind: not fear, not pride, but purpose. Let them meet the real Africa. The one that doesn't ask anymore. The Roosevelt room was quiet, unnaturally so. The only sound was the subtle hum of the HVAC system and the occasional rustle of paper. A low fire crackled behind the glass of the decorative fireplace, staged more for ambience than warmth. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood tall, his gaze scanning the room, not out of curiosity, but calculation. President Biden entered with the usual diplomatic grace, extending a hand. "Captain Traoré," he said, offering a smile sharpened by years of politics. "Thank you for coming." Traoré shook it, but said nothing. They sat. Aides stood at a distance. No press. No cameras. Just two men from different worlds, now forced to speak in a shared one. "Let me be blunt," Biden began. "We see what you're doing. You're stirring sentiment. Making moves. Drawing eyes." "I'm not drawing eyes," Traoré said calmly. Eyes were already watching. "I just spoke loud enough for them to stop pretending they weren't." Biden gave a half-laugh. "We don't want enemies in Africa." "You never wanted equals either," Traoré returned. A silence fell between them. Then Biden leaned in. "Look, I know history's been messy. I won't deny it. But the future doesn't have to be a battleground." Traoré studied him. "The future already is a battleground, Mr. President. It's just no longer being fought with bullets, but with narratives, ownership, and the illusion of partnership." "You've made a lot of people nervous," Biden said. "I was never here to make them comfortable," Traoré answered. "I came to remind them that Africa doesn't negotiate its dignity." Across the room, an aide coughed nervously. Another checked their watch. But Biden didn't move. He leaned back, processing every word. And for a rare moment, the most powerful office on earth looked not dominant, but exposed. "I'll be honest," Biden said slowly. "You remind me of someone I once underestimated. That didn't end well for me either." Traoré stood. "Then maybe history taught you something." As he turned to leave, Biden asked, "So what do you want, really?" Without looking back, Traoré replied. "Respect. On your terms, that's a gift. On mine, it's non-negotiable." When Traoré stepped out of the West Wing, the sky above Washington was overcast, but the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm. Reporters stood behind the cordon, cameras clicking like gunfire. But he gave no statement. Just a glance, measured, unshaken, as if to say, "You already know what I'm here for." But the city had already begun to feel his presence. Across the Potomac, in Howard University's grand auditorium, hundreds of students packed into the seats to watch a live-streamed panel. The African voice, beyond aid, beyond apology. And though Traoré wasn't there in person, his words were quoted like scripture. "Respect is not requested, it is reclaimed." In southeast D.C., murals of Traoré began appearing overnight on alley walls, often side by side with portraits of Malcolm X and Patrice Lumumba. Local community leaders hosted town halls, asking a new question. If a 36-year-old in Burkina Faso can confront empire, what are we waiting for? Meanwhile, right-wing commentators on television descended into panic mode. "Who the hell does this guy think he is?" barked Tucker Carlson. "Coming into our house and lecturing our president? That's not diplomacy, that's insurgency." But the public was listening. And many weren't angry, they were inspired. In a bold editorial, the New York Times published a front-page opinion titled, "Traoré didn't just speak for Africa, he spoke for the unheard." In response, black congressional leaders arranged a private dinner in Georgetown. Traoré declined. Not out of pride, but out of focus. "Symbolism doesn't feed nations," he said quietly to his aide. "We need outcomes. Structure. Permanence." At the World Bank headquarters, African economists working within the system suddenly felt a ripple of rebellion. Internal memos quoted his UN speech. Policy documents began including the term sovereign resource management, a phrase once considered too radical. Everywhere he went, or didn't go, his presence ignited recalibration. Because the world hadn't just seen a defiant African leader walk into the belly of the beast, they saw him walk out unburned. And that image would linger far longer than any soundbite. The night before his scheduled departure, a quiet message was circulated through diplomatic back-channels, Ivy League universities, and activist circles. Captain Ibrahim Traoré will speak at the Lincoln Memorial. 1 hour only. No press. No podium. The announcement spread like wildfire. By dawn, thousands had gathered, students, activists, foreign dignitaries, veterans of civil rights marches. Some came holding Burkinabe flags, others signs reading, "We hear you," or "Africa isn't asking, it's answering." No stage was built. No microphone was tested. When Traoré arrived, it was in silence. He walked to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, paused beneath the shadow of the giant seated figure, and turned to face the crowd. His voice, firm, unamplified, carried anyway. Power, he began, doesn't always look like weapons or wealth. Sometimes it looks like silence, used as a shield. And I've learned that if you want to break that shield, you must speak, even when no one invites you. He spoke of land, of theft, of memory. Of how maps were drawn by those who never lived on the soil they divided. Of how aid is offered with one hand and stolen back with the other. Of how language can enslave as surely as chains. "I came here not for handshakes," he said. "I came to make sure you understand, Africa is not emerging. We were forced underground. And now we're resurfacing, not to beg, but to build." A woman in the crowd began to weep. An elderly man raised a fist. And a group of African American teenagers from Baltimore shouted, "Tell M, Captain." He nodded once, then ended with words that would be quoted, painted, and carved in more than one place. "You can ignore us. But you cannot unhear us. We're already inside your silence." Then, just like that, he turned and walked away. No exit music. No motorcade fanfare. Just footsteps against history's marble. By the time he reached the tarmac at Dulles Airport, his speech had already gone viral, recorded from dozens of phones, translated into 10 languages by sundown. But Traoré wasn't watching the views. He stared out the window of his plane as it taxied down the runway, his fingers tapping a quiet rhythm against the armrest. "Now," he whispered, "let's see what they do when we speak from our own soil." As the presidential jet sliced through the Sahel sky, the orange horizon of Burkina Faso burned beneath it, like a furnace awakening after long dormancy. When the wheels touched the Ouagadougou runway, crowds were already gathered along the fences. Children on shoulders, elders waving handmade banners, drummers pounding out the rhythm of something deeper than celebration. It was return. It was vindication. The hatch opened, and Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the dry African air, his uniform still crisp from Washington, but his gaze softer now, not relaxed, but anchored. At the foot of the stairs, his ministers waited, flanked by soldiers and citizens alike. "You were louder than all their silence," whispered his defense chief. Traoré nodded, but didn't smile. "There's no time to celebrate," he said. "We made noise in their house. Now we build walls in ours." Within hours, a national address was broadcast, not just to Burkina Faso, but streamed to every African capital. "We've seen what they fear, not our anger, but our clarity. Not our protests, but our plans. So let this be clear, the age of petitions is over. The age of architecture has begun." In Dakar, in Bamako, in Kinshasa, watch parties erupted into chants. Even in Paris, African students took to the streets, holding signs that read, "Traoré showed them our silence was strategy." Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department scrambled to contain what they now called the Traoré effect. Think tanks issued papers. Lobbyists panicked. One headline from Foreign Affairs captured the tremor. "The young captain who outplayed the old empire." But Traoré didn't care for editorials. He moved swiftly, signing land reform decrees, pushing through Pan-African trade agreements, and inviting regional leaders for a summit not in Geneva, but in Ouagadougou. Africa, he insisted, would no longer visit the world's table, it would host its own. And beneath the rising sun, as a new wall was being erected, not to divide, but to declare, a phrase was carved into stone in 3 languages. This land will no longer be borrowed, begged for, or bargained over. It is ours. And we begin again. Traoré stood before it, alone. But he did not feel alone. Because behind him stood not just a nation, but a storm. And this time, it wasn't coming, it had arrived.